There were two phases of the piece of research. One, a literature review, a systematic review of the literature, looking at issues essentially of transitions for these young people between school and college, between college and work, and how what evidence there is in the research about their trajectories and the barriers they face. And as you probably expect, there isn't an awful lot of research in the literature that addresses this particular group of students, of young people, rather than students, directly. Subsequent to that, Olga Cara, my colleague here, has carried out some quantitative analysis of a very large data set that's held here at the Institute of Education, in order to try and find if some of these elements, use of English as an additional language, the nature of their bilingualism, their language use at home, all of these things, whether they in fact also have an impact on trajectories of young people, and whether those impacts are positive, whether those impacts are negative, and whether we as a system, as an educational system, recognize and make the most of those benefits that could come from these young people, but do our systems also support them as they go through? With the very simple process today, very pleased to have Professor Li Wei with us, who I'll introduce shortly, who will talk to you in general about this area and the importance of research in this area. We'll then ask Olga to present the quantitative analysis that she's done, and then Vera Hutchinson, my colleague here at the Institute as well, will also come on and talk about the literature review. And then Laura Cook of the Bell Foundation, who's the ESOL policy manager at the Bell Foundation, will finish our presentations with some thoughts on the policy implications of what we heard. At that point, we'll open it out to the audience, for you to come in with your comments and questions and your reflections on what you've heard, which we'll ask you to do through the chat. I don't think we can give you access to microphones on this system, but we'll be monitoring the chat as we go through. So put any comments and questions down there, and we'll try to address them as carefully as we can. Right, let's get beginning. I'm going to ask Li Wei to begin the event, to open the event. Professor Li Wei is the director and dean of the Institute of Education. He also used to be, I don't think you are anymore, are you, the chair of the Centre for Applied Linguistics, so sort of was my boss before, and certainly is my boss now. And it's very nice to see you here, Li Wei. Li Wei's the ideal person to contextualize this for us. Absolutely world-leading scholar in applied linguistics, with a focus on bilingualism and multilingualism, and a very positive, if I can say, a very positive research approach and a very positive approach to this area. There's no element of deficit in the work that Li Wei does, and I think that's something that we see in policy terms, an awful lot of deficit approaches and an awful lot of negativity about bilingualism, where I think we like in the Centre for Applied Linguistics and the work that I've read of Li Wei's to present a much more positive message about the potential of bilingual children, and perhaps how we're not serving them adequately. So Li Wei, I'm not going to take any more time, so I'm going to hand straight over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all today and to support the launch of this very important and useful report. Now, when we look at Britain's contributions to the world, the English language is way up there. The world has been fundamentally affected by English. It's hard to imagine the world without it. But one dimension of that fact is quite often neglected, is that English is also an immigrant language from the perspective of the rest of the world, or what is now called the global majority. Indeed, it is the largest immigrant language in the world, except that we don't often use that term to describe English. Instead, we call it second language, and in some parts of the world that has not been affected directly by the former British colonialism, it's also a foreign language. English is the largest second and foreign language in the world. there are more speakers of English who have acquired it as a second or foreign language than those who speak it as a first or only language. When some of these people come to the UK, they become immigrants, and English becomes an additional language for them. Britain has always had a significant immigrant community who speak English as an additional language. A crucial difference between the majority of immigrant English speakers outside Britain and the EAL users here in Britain is that the latter tend to be more bilingual and multilingual, where many English speakers remain largely monolingual in English abroad. So an important question is how we treat English vis-a-vis the other languages, people of immigrant and ethnic minority backgrounds in Britain. For me, the most important point is that the English language should not be a barrier to success for anyone. This is an issue of equity and social justice. And in an era of decolonization, it is an issue that people in social policy and education should be most concerned with. So it is extremely timely to have the report that is being launched today. You will hear more about the contents of the report and the analysis very soon, so I'm not going to spoil it now. But it is a quantitative analysis into the education and employment outcomes of young people who speak English as an additional language, based on a longitudinal study of cohort of young people born in 1989 to 1990. Now, quantitative analysis of this kind is rare in this area of research, and the focus on employment outcome is particularly significant and useful. We need robust research evidence of this kind for policy and practice. So I'm extremely pleased that colleagues from the IOE, especially Olga, Vera, David, and others, have led this work, and I'm very grateful to the Bell Foundation for their support. The Bell Foundation, as I'm sure you all know, aims to overcome disadvantage through language education by working with partners on innovation, research, training, and practical interventions. And the IOE is not only the largest initial teacher education provider in the country, but also a world-leading research institution that has been ranked world #1 for the last 8 years running. I'm delighted that the Bell Foundation and the IOE have partnered in a range of work regarding EAL learners and users. I'm looking forward to future further collaborations between our two organizations. Thank you and congratulations to the researchers who have carried out this really important piece of work. Back to you, David.
Thank you, Li Wei. Excellent. Perfect context for us. And yeah, very, very good to hear your thoughts on this. Let's move straight on to the content of the research that Li Wei was referring to. And I'll hand over to Olga to begin the presentation on what she found through this analysis. Olga, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Olga Cara. So I was leading on quantitative analysis to look into post-16 education and training outcomes for young people who use English as an additional language, focusing particularly on their aspirations, trajectories, and outcomes. So the executive summaries are available on Bell Foundation website, and full reports will be available soon as well, within probably a month's time, to look into more detail. So this presentation will be relatively short, just to point out some more specific and key findings. Before I go into the findings, just to give a little bit of background and rationale for this research. So in 2021, 21% of primary and 17% of secondary pupils in England were classified as having English as an additional language. Of course, this is just a label, a very tricky label. So the EAL classification does not indicate pupil proficiency in the English language, and that the difference between different pupils and their circumstances is really great. So the group is also very diverse based on many other characteristics. So therefore, when we're looking at the average attainment figures for this group, they are often misleading, as they are hiding different groups who are maybe underachieving and some groups who are achieving high. So the average really doesn't say much for this diverse group. In addition to that, very few studies were exploring how the EAL status, which is usually a label or identifier attached in compulsory education, links to post-16 outcomes. And there is a range of reasons for that, one being that it's very hard to identify young people who use English additional language in post-16 education when they are outside compulsory education, particularly school sector. Even though it is quite tricky, there is some research which exists, and it shows that there are indeed differences in post-16 outcomes and pathways based on one's first language in the UK context. So young people and adults who use EAL, particularly those who are English learners at earlier stages, they tend to do worse on the labor market. So this is very, very recent data. The report just came out this year. And young people are more likely to be not in employment, education and training later in life. At the same time, the same research demonstrates that if these groups of young people achieve a degree or level 3 qualifications, this is associated with better labor market outcomes, specifically for this group. So this is just background rationale for our study. Methodology. So we were looking at what next steps data indicates with regards to aspirations, outcomes, and pathways of learners who use English additional language. And so the age range or the age timeline we were looking at was 16 to 25. And we were comparing this group to a group of young people who identified English as their first language or as their only language. Next steps is a longitudinal study of young people. So at the beginning, over 16,000 young people were included, and they were born in 1989 and 90. It is a nationally representative sample of year 9 students aged 13-14, and they were interviewed alongside with their parents and carers. So there is additional information. They were interviewed every year since the year 9. And they were followed up to age 32. The data currently available is for the age 25 as the last time point, and this is what we used for our analysis. The data is extremely rich and it focuses on education, so there are many different characteristics and variables measured. And also this data, the sampling was based on over recruiting for ethnic minorities, which allows them to do research focusing also on young people who use EAL. Our main characteristic, what we used here, was a question what young people were asked when they were age 13, whether English was their first or main language, and there was a range of different answers. So we combined those with the place of birth. So not all young people who are included in this cohort study were born in the UK, so we used that as well. And we came up with 6 groups. So we have a group of young people who report English as their only language. So we call them monolingual English, born in the UK, and then a group who is born elsewhere. Then we have self-identified bilingual young people, and it's important to know that it's their self-identification. They chose that label for themselves, so we don't know what it means exactly for them. And again, the same, born in the UK and born as well. And young people who report then having another language as their first or main language. So those using English as an additional language, and this is grouped in the center of our study. There are limitations for the use of this data. So there is attrition over time. You know, when people are followed from the age of 13 to the age of 25 or 32, there will be attrition. It is accounted for by different statistical techniques, but it's still very tricky to account for something where, for example, the whole group may disappear. So maybe young people who are more likely to move outside the UK, and maybe they have different pathways. So they are not represented in the sample as an example. It's also so all young people arrived into the UK by the age of 13, as the sampling base was used young people at that stage in England in schools. So we cannot really look at someone who joins the system later or into secondary education, or even maybe outside the post-compulsory education. At the point of the analysis, we did not have access to the arrival age, although it is in the data, but because it's a protected data, we just couldn't get access to it at the point. And the data represents a specific cohort of young people born in specific times, so their education pathways and outcomes need to be really contextualized in the policy and social events of that time. So, for example, during the economic crisis in 2008, these young people were 17, 18 years old, so that may have impacted their educational choices and their employment as well, as is one of the examples. So now focusing on 4 key areas of our findings. So outcomes at the age of 25, pathways or trajectories, aspirations, and parental involvement or role parents play in these pathways. And I will talk about each at a time. I will start sort of working backwards in a way, looking at the outcomes at the age of 25, and then I will talk through to what happened then with the aspiration at the age of 13. So with regards to outcomes at the age of 25, a high proportion of young people who use EAL, so we have 64% UK born and 59% born outside the UK, and even higher proportion of those who identified as bilingual achieved a first degree or higher at the age of 25. This is, if we compare to monolingual English language speakers, 44% for UK born and 60% for born elsewhere. So this is in a way a positive finding. A high proportion of young people who use EAL achieve degrees. At the same time, we can see this polarization within the group. There is also highest proportion of those with no qualification among young people who use EAL. So that's 14% for UK born and 12% for born elsewhere. And that's at the age of 25. For bilingual young people, it's only 6% with no qualifications. And for monolingual English language speakers, it's 9% for UK born and 8% for born elsewhere. So when we look at then employment and overall the outcomes for the age of 25, we also find that 23% of young people who use EAL and were born outside the UK and 21% born in the UK are not in employment or education at the age of 25. And this is, again, the highest proportion comparing to all other groups. For monolingual English language users, it's 15% who are not in employment or education at the age of 25. And for their bilingual peers, it's 11%. this is looking at trajectories, and I know the graphs are quite small, but what you have to note here is the difference between two groups, English, so monolingual English group, UK born, and those young people who use EAL born outside the UK. And colors are quite helpful here. So the darker, sort of bluish green color, it's those in education. And this is their main activities from the age of around 15 up to the age of 25. The lighter blue is being in employment, yellow is apprenticeship or training, and the darkish gray is not being in employment or education. And you can see the trajectories of these two groups are very different from the very start. So monolingual English group, quite early on, there is a quite large proportion of young people who decide that they want to go into employment and do some maybe work-based training, but also go into apprenticeships and focus on that, so learning a trade. And the proportion just increases until the age of 19, and also then there is a higher proportion of those in employment at the age of 25. They have a significant proportion of not in employment or education at different points in time, but still the proportion is smaller than among those young people who use EAL. So young people who use EAL, they tend to stay in education for longer. In a way, it's a positive finding. So at the age of 19, 70% are still in education, compared to 41% of monolingual English group. And yet, when you look at the age of 25, you have a high proportion non-employment and education. So there is something happening between the age of 19 with regards to qualifications, whether they are appropriate to finding employment or not. And as we have seen also, there is a large group of young people who are at the age of 25 with no qualifications. So looking then at aspirations in year 9 and year 11, we can see that actually young people who are bilingual or who use EAL, they're also more likely to aspire for education, so to stay in education for longer. So the question was about what you're going to do post-16, what are your plans? And we can see that although for all groups, the proportion of those who want to stay in education increased between year 9 and year 11, but it's still highest for young people who use EAL and bilingual compared to monolingual English group, UK born, who again quite early on already decide for themselves that they want to leave full-time education and they want to continue into vocational training, learning a trade, or into employment. And the proportion is quite stable between year 9 and year 11. So when we look at parents, parents actually agree with regards to aspirations, but also looking into involvement of parents into education. And so that this is where we're trying to interpret what may be the case with parents, because young people report that they rely on parents quite a lot, and young people who use EAL and bilingual young people are more likely actually to rely on their parents. So when we look at parents asked about their involvement in their children's education in year 9 and year 11, again, the proportion of more involved parents is actually increased across all groups, but it is very high among those parents who use EAL and parents of bilingual young people. So they feel they are quite involved, and there is a high proportion involved in education. And yet 14% of parents who use EAL disagree that they know all they need, that they can help with their children's education. And that's in year 9 when young people are choosing their pathways and rely on their parents. Again, this is an important finding, that although parents who use EAL, they feel very involved, they want to help their children, but there is a significant proportion of parents who just don't feel they have sufficient knowledge to help their children. So these are just some aspects for discussion and thinking, and you may have some questions around that as well, but also they are for further exploration of what these things may mean. Value and recognition of bilingualism and multilingualism is very important. This study showed that bilingual young people, yet sort of those who self-identified as bilingual, they achieve usually the best results. So they are more likely to be in employment at the age of 25. They are more likely to have higher educational qualifications. And overall seems their pathways and trajectories coherent and linked with their aspirations. So they achieve what they want in life. There is a group of young people who use EAL who are very successful. But overall, if we are measuring it as a whole group, it's misleading because there is a group of young people who is hidden, who are hidden among an averages, who are struggling. So they are more likely to be not in employment and education at the age of 25. They have no qualifications, so they have qualifications below level 3, and they cannot fulfill their aspirations. So we also question the efficiency of advice and guidance for young people who use EAL and how they end up on those trajectories. And the data and the findings suggest the importance of advice and guidance, and also information access to vocational pathways and apprenticeships. We also recommend looking at what would be the best ways to support parents who use EAL, because they can help, hopefully they can help the young people. With regards to more academic research, but also data capturing, it's very tricky, it's very difficult and challenging to capture the diversity of the young people who use EAL and their complex pathways. Capturing complex pathways, post-16 pathways, is very difficult because they are so diverse. So it's easier maybe to measure entry, for example, to higher education, because it's, just one entry point whether they enter or not. But looking at these diverse pathways, different vocational pathways, combination of employment and education, and also that young people are less likely to have a more homogeneous pathway, so some of them may be in and out at different points in times. And also, how do we measure the successful outcomes in post-16 as well? So data on English language assessment and EAL identifying post-16 education data sets, it is an issue. It's just not there at the moment. And again, we mentioned that even capturing using EAL as identifier is quite tricky, but maybe combining it with English language assessment would be the best way in order to collect robust data and use it for monitoring and development of different recommendations and policies based on that, and to use similar identifier and similar assessment data in post-16 as well to link the two. And overall data access seems to be a great challenge with the GDPR requirements, and we recognize the ethics and the security of the data, but it's not possible to monitor these issues with sensitive data, and it seems it takes just a very long time to get the data, if at all, as some of the data is just not simply available to researchers to do analysis. Thank you so much, and we'll have time for questions and comments after all our presentations. So I'm happy to answer your questions then. Thank you.
The summary of the research that Olga's just presented, which you can find on the Bell Foundation website. I'll put later on, there's also links obviously to the literature review and also to a policy brief produced by as part of the project that Laura will talk about later. So please click through, and any look in any more details. We will make the slides available after the event as well, so that you can go back and look at in more detail at some of the numbers and some of the findings there. But as I say, please do feel free to come in. It doesn't have to be a question. You know, if you've got a comment, if there's something you think the researchers should be aware of, something the Bell Foundation should be aware of as they move forward in policy terms, then please contribute there through the chat, and we'll pick it up as the speakers are presenting. Excellent. Right, Vera, are you ready to come in, and then we'll change the slides that are being shared, and my colleague Dr. Vera Hutchinson will talk about the literature review that was carried out. Vera carried this out together with Antonina Terashenko, who's in the audience here today, and they did a literature review of these issues of young people, education, employment, and ESOL. Yeah, these transitions. What did we know? What can we find out from existing evidence about the relationship between these three things, and particularly the way in which people who use EAL transit between school and college, between college and employment, or school and employment, etc. Vera, if you want to click on your camera icon so we can see you, and then I'll disappear and leave you to it. No, Vera, is it not? Are you not managing to appear? Okay, there we go. Vera's coming on. I was just about to begin presenting there, so I'm very glad to see you, Vera. You also need to unmute yourself, or you're still on mute. Again, just making the microphone green at the top above your screen. That sounds.
Okay, apologies for that. I should be here now. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, David. So we did a literature review, which was in 2020, so it's a little while ago. So it's before the quants work. And this was our main research question. So how does current ESOL provision meet the needs of and provide adequate opportunities for young people aged 16 to 25 who are speakers of other languages to develop their English language skills and fully access education and employment in England? It's really broad. And so what we were interested in finding out about were a number of different things, really, such as what is the current education or training offer for young people aged 16 to 25 who are still developing their English language proficiency. What support is offered to young people with ESOL needs in the transition from compulsory schooling or from schools to post-16 education and training. We were also interested in what support is offered to young people, including migrants, refugees, and young people who are forced migrants who may not have attended school in the UK, but who want to develop their English language and engage in education or training and go into employment. So we were interested in the role of English language programs, such as ESOL or other programs, and looking at what role they play in enabling young people with English language needs to progress and access further education and training opportunities, and how effective post-16 policies and processes were in integrating and supporting young people with ESOL needs. What factors enable successful and effective provision? What are the barriers to effective provision? So as you can see, it's a very broad range of questions there. Just to explain a little bit what we did. So in terms of our methodology, we drew up a search strategy which included identifying some of the key transitions for different groups of young people aged 16 to 25. So the searches we conducted using educational and multidisciplinary databases, as you can see. And we were searching for peer-reviewed papers which address relevant research and policy in the 4 UK nations, in European countries, and in other English-dominant jurisdictions, including the US, Canada, and Australia. So as you can see, there are exclusion and inclusion criteria here. So, we we just looked at literature that was written in English, for example. And so that was sort of a limitation. And we also just looked at research that was published after 2010 as well. And we obviously documented our search terms, but it was principally looking at ESOL, English speaks of other languages, and EAL, English as an additional language. But we weren't looking in general at English as a foreign language and all the resources and research in that area, or ELT, English language teaching. Okay, so something about the sample. Initial searches found very limited research literature specifically focused on young people who use English as an additional language aged 16 to 25. So we did more detailed searches on looking for literature on young people 16 to 18 or 16 to 19, and for young adults sort of 19 plus. The approach we took in the literature review was to follow the process for a systematized review. So bearing in mind the gaps that we identified in the literature, and there were a lot, and the importance of undertaking a comprehensive review that would address the research questions. So the inclusion criteria for the literature review included peer-reviewed empirical studies and published reports, studies relating to young people using English as an additional language in the age group 16 to 25, and research which offered further insights into ESOL provision and transition processes affecting young people. So there were a total of 47 empirical studies that we identified as evidence in the literature review. So of those, 24 studies could be described as qualitative, 13 as quantitative, and 10, you could say, employed mixed methods. So there's a wide variation in the research approaches and in the evidence presented in the empirical research in the literature review. And so in the review, we don't aim to rate these studies in terms of standardized methodological rigor. We examined a range of research designs in the literature review, recognizing that there are useful insights to be gained from even small studies, as long as the study limitations are acknowledged. Summaries of the studies, including details of the research methodology employed in each study, are included in an appendix to the full literature review, which will be available shortly. So looking at our main findings, and I think you'll be able to see much more if you look at the executive summary, which I think David may put up the details for. You can also find on the Bell website. So just picking out some of those main findings. As mentioned just now, there were very few studies specifically looking at this age group. In fact, there were only 9 studies that we found that had a specific focus on the age group 16 to 25. We found there's very limited research on young people's educational employment trajectories in the literature. And this was made more difficult as young people who need time to develop their English language skills in order to progress in education, training and employment. They cannot, as Olga mentioned, they cannot easily be identified in post-school contexts, as there is currently no identifier in the individual learning record, which is used by FE providers. So the age group 16 to 25 encompasses a very wide range of young people with a wide spectrum of educational backgrounds and experience, and including young people with limited schooling in their own expert languages. And there are other issues that are really important to consider, such as, for example, the age of arrival, for example, in England, which obviously affects the provision and affects young people and what's on offer for them. There is an established education offer in England for post-16 learners from entry levels to level 4 and above. The research highlighted a high demand for ESOL, with most provision at low levels up to entry 3. There was a limited ESOL offer in many regions at level 1 and level 2, when young people were often placed in functional English classes and then GCSE English language classes. And a key point that Olga also brought up and found in the quants was a general lack of independent information, advice and guidance for young people. including information on pathways to training and employment, and also a need for information about the English education system. We looked at what might be examples of some successful interventions or classroom approaches or practices. And certainly one of the things that came up very much in the literature was having an assets-based approach, which values young people's linguistic repertoires and the resources they bring to the classroom as being very important in motivating and engaging young people, rather than any kind of deficit-based approach. So focusing on what young people are bringing, and on their linguistic resources rather than on what they can't do. ESOL and content-based classroom materials as well should be research-based and reflect the broad needs and interests of different communities of young people. A number of studies emphasize the importance of authentic materials for ESOL learning, reflecting the formal and informal learning context of different groups of young adults. In terms of provision, third sector organisations have a key role in ESOL provision in many parts of England. And so, for example, 2 book chapters in Cook and Putrell 2019, whilst not specifically focused on the 16 to 25 age group, give some really interesting examples of how a community-based approach has been used in the UK, where formal and informal approaches to language learning and community integration can go hand in hand. And there are also examples from other parts of the world in that area too. The role of qualified and specialist ESOL tutors was highlighted in a number of studies. The research literature on 16 to 19 ESOL provision emphasises the enhanced role of the tutor in offering multi-agency support, particularly for 16 to 19 students who are new to England and with limited prior education. And 6 studies also highlighted the need for curricula which enable young people who use English as an additional language to access higher level courses, and the key role of ESOL tutors in advancing professional learning between ESOL and vocational specialists to support the learning of both academic English and content knowledge. Thinking about the challenges facing young people 16 to 25, a Health Foundation report by Jordan 2019 identified 4 assets which affect how well young people make the transition to adulthood. And these included appropriate skills and qualifications, personal connections, financial and practical support, and emotional support. And young people, especially those at the early stages of developing their skills in English, may lack some or all of those assets, facing significant barriers in gaining advice and guidance, and challenges in accessing appropriate ESOL provision, potentially leading to a lack of engagement in education, training, or employment. So the review highlighted also how qualifications may disadvantage young people who may still need to develop their English language learning. Transitions from ESOL classes to functional skills English and then to GCSE English language, they reflect substantial differences in curricular content and forms of assessment. However, young people who still need to develop their English proficiency may be disadvantaged if they sit GCSE English language qualifications before they're ready, and so they're forced to undertake resits. And then from the research we found that people have less success in resits, and so it becomes a vicious circle, I think, for young people. So the area of qualifications is something that's really important to look at. And there are other issues that are challenges as well for specific groups of people, such as how entitlements for language learning are linked to issues around citizenship and eligibility, cost. And also there's a lot that we don't know. For example, young people who arrive late in England as forced migrants, for example, may be dispersed to different parts of the country, may not be able to join, go to a school if they're arriving around the time of GCSEs. So that we need to know a lot more about what happens to some of these young people. That information wasn't always available. Okay. Just a short bit on recommendations, because I think maybe Laura will go on a bit further in developing these ideas in terms of thinking about policy. But certainly the literature review and the limited research available highlighted the need for a focus on research and policy and pedagogy for this age group, 16 to 25 years, including how these diverse groups of young people develop English language skills whilst also undertaking other transitions that they need to make in their lives. Young people, then again, coming back to the idea of information, advice and guidance. Young people need to have information about the wide range of options available to them, including pathways to employment, such as apprenticeships. And from what we could see that wasn't always the case. We found 5 studies specifically who highlighted how the provision of independent and comprehensive information, advice and guidance and targeted career support is particularly crucial. Okay. Great. I'm going to stop there and please ask any questions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vera. Thank you very much. Excellent. Right, so we've seen the context that the literature we provided, and we've looked at some of the quant findings in this area as well. I'm going to ask Laura to come in now, and Laura's going to talk to us about the policy implications of this piece of research. Laura Cook is the Bell Foundation's ESOL Policy and Programme Manager. I'm sure lots of you know who she is. I'll also put in the chat the link to the policy briefing that was produced following the literature review. And there's Laura there. Laura's on the screen. Laura, I'm going to hand it straight over to you. I'll put the link in the chat. We've got one question coming in already here from Kazia. Thank you very much for that. We'll pick those up. So do listen to Laura and listen carefully. But as you're listening, do put down any comments or anything you would like us to refer back to. If you'd like any further clarification as well of either of the reports, then please use the chat to do so. Okay, I'm going to click on my camera and turn my camera off. Vera, just click on the green camera and it'll go red.
Lovely, thank you very much, David. Thank you. Great. So yeah, at the Bell Foundation, one thing we're really keen to do is to ensure that the research that we commission translates into policy recommendations. So that's why we're publishing a policy briefing at the same time today. So I'm briefly going to talk to you now about some of those policy recommendations. It's really clear from the research that we don't actually know the scale of need in terms of ESOL provision for young people. There's a real lack of data in this area. And actually, this could be a real barrier to some young people in accessing ESOL courses. So there are 2 recommendations that we have in relation to this. Firstly, the Department for Education should introduce statutory requirement to schools in England to assess and record the proficiency of English of pupils who use EAL. Alongside this, there also needs to be a mechanism to ensure that an EAL marker is introduced on the National Pupil Database. That should go beyond compulsory education, but also there needs to be a marker on individualised learner records that go into further education where this is appropriate. This will also, ensure that we can clearly see and keep a record of the education employment outcomes for young people who use English as an additional language. But it also means that we can have an idea, a sense, and get that scale of need and understanding of what is required in terms of ESOL provision. So the research also shows us that ESOL provision is in really high demand, but it is also very fragmented. And this means that it can be quite difficult for young people and adults as well, actually, to access appropriate ESOL provision. So what we need in this sense is a government vision, a cross-government vision for ESOL that would coordinate all the different government policies and all those different funding streams. And included in this vision should be things like the funding options for ESOL, which would allow time for a young person who uses English as an additional language to reach the high levels of ESOL required for both higher education and potentially highly skilled jobs. We want young people to achieve their aspirations. We want them to be able to achieve their goals. But as we know, it can take many years to reach proficiency in English that is required to get to that level. Also in the strategy, we would like to see ESOL embedded into apprenticeships and vocational qualifications. We want to see and understand the impact that this could have on young people who use English as an additional language. Being able to learn English alongside those practical qualifications and being able to learn the language that is required for those particular roles and those sectors could potentially have some, a good impact on young people's outcomes in employment. So underpinning all of this is something that has been talked about and has come through this research. It's that need for accessible information, advice and guidance, in particular for young people who use English as an additional language. Now, while there are plans to strengthen information, advice and guidance in the Skills and Post-16 Education Bill, we want to see those efforts are made to make sure that it is accessible. We want to make sure that that information and careers and guidance is available to every young person who uses English as an additional language. Those young people really need to be empowered so that they can make those informed decisions about their education and employment choices. So to conclude, we can see that there are more changes that are required that we can ensure that every young person has the opportunity to achieve the outcomes and those aspirations that they have. Everyone should, be able to have access to the information and be empowered to make those decisions and be able to achieve what they want in their goals in life. So these are some of the key recommendations and the key points that we have in the policy briefing, but please do read the report for more of those recommendations that we are making. And now I'll hand back to David and we can have some questions and answers.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Laura. Very, very focused. It is very interesting, isn't it? We get to this stage and the research is showing that we don't know. And the community is looking and saying we're not being listened to. And then various communities whose work impacts trajectories of these young people are also working in isolation from each other. So the need for, in any area, strategic thought and strategic planning in order to address these things that are not new, and they're things that I was told 10 years ago when I worked on an EAL strategy for the Teacher Development Agency, and people like, and I can see a number of people in the audience who told me lots of these things when I first appeared to look at this area. So people like Tony Fazeli who's here, Constant Jung who's in the audience, do know all of these things and have been telling us these things for a long time. So one thing I think we could discuss is why nobody listens, and whether that's a fault of the research. Is the research not framed in the right way? Is that just fragmentation of the system, or is there something more fundamental we can do? And as a research community, we should be thinking, why have we not filled the gaps in ways that would have made that literature review more meaningful? Because lots of literature reviews find a lack of evidence, but this one found a glaring lack of evidence about this particular group. And then what is it about this particular group, the 16 to 25s with EAL, that means that they're not contemplated in the normal development of policy, that their trajectories and the specificities of their educational experience is not considered, is not contemplated as we design systems? We've got one question in the chat so far from Kazia. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Kazia, asking about the idea that those with EAL will more quickly be placed on vocational courses, with the idea that those vocational courses have a less rigorous put less rigorous demands on the English language than an academic route would do. And I think that's very true. And again, this is something that I don't think is new, and we need to document and evidence. And I'll ask Olga if there's anything in the data that she can comment on this, but also relate it to what Laura's just said about the need for higher level ESOL courses. If students are allowed to formally study language to a higher level with the possibility of gaining qualifications that really will prepare them for vocational and other things, giving them more time to study the language, and then maybe they would opt to follow an academic route, but maybe they would also, at the same time, they could embark on a professional route, but with more confidence, more purposefully. So I certainly think that that link is clear. Olga, is there something in the data that you could comment on that relationship?
Yeah, so it seems that yes, indeed, some young people who use EL are more likely to be placed. I wouldn't say vocational qualifications, but definitely to go to further education colleges rather than, for example, to stay in sixth form. But one thing about it is that when they asked about their aspirations, that many of them, or that proportion of them, also wants to do it, so they plan to do it. And this is where I think advice and guidance comes in, because they have this idea from somewhere. And it seems, yes, they are made to believe, but that this is their pathway. And then it seems that when it comes, they stay in education, which again seems as a positive sort of a superficial outcome, because government really wants to keep young people in education. And this is where I think a more strategic thinking then comes in, thinking about what works in education. And we're all asking what works. So it seems government found the answer, keeping young people in education for as long as we can will solve all the problems, because education is like a magic wand which you wave or keep someone in and there you go, including young people who use EAL. But it's not. The question to ask is, what works for who? So what works for these young people? And this is where, like Laura said, just giving them appropriate information in appropriate way, also supporting the whole family rather than just young people. Of course, the issue is with some young people where they don't have family around them, like unaccompanied minors, but that wasn't in the quantitative study because all had, families because they were selected in that way for the study. But yes, definitely. So there is something where young people are pushed into a pathway or trajectory which is not of their choice and which is just not appropriate for them, but which on books for whoever, schools, colleges may look, and government may look really good until the age of 19. And then at the age of 25, you have the group who struggles.
Absolutely. Thank you, Olga. And we're starting to get a few comments coming in as well here, again from Kazi, and there's a couple of comments also from David Hughes that I think are related in terms of opportune moments. And Kazi's comment is suggesting perhaps, I think, that that our rather hostile approach to immigration, and particularly to immigrants, is intertwined with this. And I'm not going to comment on that. That's a very political question that I don't have the data on, but there's certainly a natural narrative there. And David, maybe more looking on the positive side of our political leaders and what they like, is suggesting that maybe our Prime Minister has a love affair with skills. I'm not sure I'd agree with that, David, but yes, there's certainly a lot of narrative around skills that we can place our demands, our suggestions, the policy recommendations that Bell are making in that context of a focus on skills. And as Olga says, a focus on keeping young people in education, and just demand that that education is appropriate, and that education is not just a place to put people, but is a place through which people can prosper. So David's saying that the focus on technical education is a good point for us to be able to go in and say, well, if we want to train an awful lot more people, language is an issue, and we therefore need to have strategic thought about how we create these pathways into and out of technical education so that it doesn't exclude this group of people. I'm going to read a comment here from Marguerite Hogg. Saw an interesting case study in Finland a few years ago with a Finnish language teacher working alongside the vocational teacher to support adult learners whose first language wasn't Finnish. It might be an expensive model. There are lots of expensive parts of our system, and lots of those expensive parts of our system have been around for years and years because that's what it costs, and therefore we have to spend it. So part of our job here is to decide what actually do we need to make money on. To make money on, not to make money, to spend money on. And in this case, it could be having, almost a dual approach of vocational teacher, language teacher, which We did have in FE in the early 2000s that sort of model of joint work between practitioners of literacy, ESOL, numeracy, and vocational teachers. And I'm sure there's lots more. There's lots more examples of that. Kay's got another example in Wales. Family learning located in high schools, providing a hub for parents and families to build their skills, with ESOL and other learning, building a relationship with the school, and parents then engaging and connecting to other things. And yeah, the schools have this information, don't they? And they can guide people. How do you transition into HE? What should the parents do? What is HE in our system? And what are the choices you're being asked to make? These are all really important things for parents to know, to be able to support their children. And as Olga was suggesting earlier on, quite often it seems there are a large 15% of those parents who feel they just don't have that information. Now, the sort of example that Kay's describing there, using family learning to support families in their own learning, but also so that they feel part of the school community, and so that they feel that they have access to the information that they need to be able to support their children, is definitely an important part of the equation. And as Laura said, we need to have a strategic, rounded vision of how this works. It's not a series of isolated initiatives. And the last thing I'll say before I mention another question is, a lot of these initiatives, and I'm sure we all know fabulous things that are going on, they are going on slightly in isolation. Perhaps again, this is to do with the research community not being well enough connected to those to populate the literature and produce evidence from these examples, or perhaps it's just because they are quite isolated themselves in policy terms in the system. Tony Faselli here is asking a very big question. Can UCL colleagues tell us about the characteristics of research that sticks and leads to impacts? Well, I think, Tony, shame you can't come on, because I'm sure you'd be able to answer it much better than we can. I'll say one very simple thing, which is that the research of the type that Olga's done on using a large data set and using that data set in a way to address questions and locating specific groups within that data set, that data set wasn't designed for this piece of research, but it allows for investigation of questions related to these things that is trusted in policy circles because it's big numbers. But of course, that's just not enough, because as we've seen, that sort of research is missing an awful lot of things that are actually happening in an awful lot of ways in which individuals, small groups have benefited from interventions and the actions of certain professionals or structures that are set up in their local area. So I do think we need more work on large-scale data sets. We need more influence over the data that's collected within those studies, the cohorts and other longitudinal and large-scale studies. We need to make sure that we're identifying the right things so we can follow these trajectories. And a lot of these young people just get lost because they're not labeled in the right way, or they're mislabeled, or we just don't realize that we need a particular label. When you then go on to, because Tony's then talking about Dylan Williams's research on learning styles. Sorry, Dylan Williams discredited, didn't he? But the work on learning styles, I think that sort of research had huge impact because it was so easy for people to understand. It had a very clear message. I don't think it was a true message, but it had a very clear message. And that was very easily applicable to pedagogy. So there's a large job to do here, is to say, well, what does this mean in terms of pedagogy? What does it mean in terms of the classroom? And then obviously the other levels of policy. But the learning style stuff, I think, was very effective because it seemed scientific and it was very easy to get your head around. Olga, Laura, please, I'm just talking here because it's slightly frustrating we can't get.
I can add actually. David or anybody else. I can add to the point about what research would government listen to. I mean, I know I think the thing with the young people who use EL and overall with ethnicity and language, these are very complex things because they don't come as a just one identifier. So government wants, and they have it in the system, all educational data in compulsory education is split by first language, meaning English is your first language, English is not your first language. But the research can't deal with that. It's government, it's the ideal, which is not possible. It doesn't tell you anything. To do research in this area, it means to make things almost too complicated to deal with for the government, because I can understand governments well, because they have a limited amount of money, they have to spend it on something, and they have really clear sort of guidance, data, evidence where it would be spent in the most efficient way. The research cannot give them that answer. What could give them that answer would be maybe a research, you know, like different pieces of research, which then come together and then you sort of build it back. So it's like you have a puzzle or something. So each research, individual projects are looking at different pieces of the puzzle. And then you may get, hopefully, that picture where then you can use it to make policy decisions. With this study, we just sort of scratched the surface a little bit to deconstruct the EL. We just touched it, we just split it into more than two and included place of birth, but then you can go and do more and more, and you need to do more. You need to include the actual knowledge of English. You need to include, you know, some other aspects as well. Obviously, psychology comes in because this research is really based on, you know, attitudes and social things rather than even, you know, like psychological things. Yeah, so I think because it's just so complicated, but some sort of program, larger program from government about languages would work, would help. That would be a good basis for further things, and actually would link to skills, you know, how languages can be used, because equally you could explore within the same framework how monolingual English speakers learning other languages do something else and how it links to skills. So you could do that. And I think just one point to make about the family learning, which is another area of my research, those programs are really, really great. And even within this study, we could see, because parents already have some ideas about what they want their children to do with regards to aspirations, you know, really by the end probably of primary schools. So stepping in earlier, providing that information where parents and children and young people later on can make those decisions is very important. FE, or further education, vocational pathways, are so complex. It's easier maybe to find something about higher education, you know, how to enter university, because it's also more, I guess, cross-culturally understood how people enter university. It's sort of everywhere. You do your exams at the end of secondary school, high school, whatever you call it, and you go to university. How do you enter a specific vocational program if you want to be, I don't know, the most current one, a truck driver, you know? How do you do it? Even, you know, what qualifications are needed? What's better, you know? And also you have all these stereotypes, obviously, which come in together with, like, what is higher education and what is further education, what are vocational pathways and what are academic pathways, and who is, you know, doing what and why. And this is where, again, work is needed and more research is needed to see what are the factors that influence the choices, you know, how to kind of promote vocational education, but only where it's needed. So it's not someone telling this is the group and they need vocational education, but just saying, you know, vocational education is an option. This is how you do it. Consider it. If you think it's for you, you know, our job is done. So you are sort of in the right pathway. But it's tricky. I think working around advice and guidance and role modeling, I think role models is another huge area, because, you know, young people who use EL are less less likely to have broader social networks, and their parents are less likely to have broader social networks. So role modeling, showing what's possible for a range of, young people is important.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Thank you all. It's really, really helpful. Just a quick, Laura, I'll just come back to you with Hutchinson in a minute, just to give the comment that Tony said here, which I think is relevant to that, exactly what Olga was saying there. We don't have an English language proficiency indicator in the MPD or the ILR, which are the two data sets for schools, the National Pupil Database and the Individualised Learner Record for FE. So that we don't have these markers in there, and that it must contribute to the invisibility of this group and the lack of contemplation of this group, because they're not marked out specifically. So yeah, I think that, and whether it's part of a levelling up policy context, I'm not sure we want to get into quite so specifically, but it certainly could be something that, related to what David was saying earlier, that we could push for as part of that agenda. Perhaps we have to be a bit cleverer politically and use some of these concepts, these policy concepts, in order to fill them with ideas that might actually make a difference. Laura, do you want to go address the Constance comment here?
Yes, and I was also going to back up what you were just saying there, actually, around being able to use some of what the government is saying and really highlighting that you want people to be going into jobs and be going to their terminology, the government terminology, highly skilled jobs, and so actually, we need to be constantly reminding them of that English language is definitely part of that, and we don't want to be, saying that some group of people will only be able to achieve certain goals, or whatever, just because they face specific language barriers, and being able to demonstrate that and you take advantage of the opportunities that we've got at the moment. And I think connected to that as well, and also going to what Constant was saying, and there's definitely a role for the Bell Foundation to be changing that narrative as well, and to be working with organisations, with a network, getting everyone on board with this communication about the importance of languages and the skills that language learning brings, and that kind of real huge benefits of being multilingual as well. So yeah, I think that's certainly something, a role that we can all play in, when we're talking to governments in how we develop skills, and developing workforces and things, is making sure that language is very much part of that conversation. That's what I would definitely say. Oh, David, you're on mute.
Hugh from Refugee Education UK sounds as though should be also as part of that conversation. He mentioning here their work with young asylum seekers and refugees in terms of access to FE. So one of those transitions that we were trying to investigate. I'm sure there'll be lots to learn from the work of Refugee Education UK in terms of guidance and how we support that transition. So that's certainly something to learn from. And David again mentioning political opportunities here with Nadim Zahawi, who's who in the interviews I've seen with him, he seems to be reasonably reflective about his own language learning experience, or his own trajectory in language learning. So yeah, it's a good target for Bell and for all of us. So yes, the point, I think that, and there are lots more experienced people in the room than me in terms of engaging with policymakers, but it does seem to me, in my experience, you have to have a big story to tell the policymakers. You can't give them part of the story, because there are so many competing stories that if you can go there with a reasonably full explanation, not only of what you want to achieve, but the stages that you might achieve that through, and obviously, and this is where the data comes in, the impacts that those changes might have. And if you can then align those impacts with the policy desires of that particular group of policymakers, and they may be entirely political, or they may just be more technical in terms of them wanting to spend certain amounts of their budgets on certain things. If we can align our ideas to be those things, or to name those things correctly in alignment with what government's priorities are, then we're more likely to be successful. David, he said in the meeting we have with him this week that his test for education recovery is whether it works for children who are like he was at age 11. Well, that's great. I mean, I'm not sure. I think all politicians, that's one of their measures, isn't it? Would it have been good for me? Would it have helped me in my own story? And linking our own messages to personal trajectories of politicians is, you know, that's the way to do it, because they're people who, you know, they want to achieve things and they want to make a difference and they want to have their name on policies that are popular and achieve things. And so, great. Let's cross our fingers and hope that Nadine comes through for us.
David, can I raise another point? I think so. From the data, we have to be careful about how we position bilingualism and multiple languages, because on one hand, we want to say how great bilingualism is. You know, talking about, you know, personal experiences, I speak 3 languages and I'm great, you know, not just because I'm arrogant, but, you know, indeed, I can see how I can use all these languages. But if we then switch, because currently, you know, the story is, so EAL, young people who identified as EAL almost are doing actually quite great on average. And we continue pushing for bilingualism and saying that everyone who is bilingual speaks multiple languages, English additional language, it's not an issue because they're even doing better. They will sort themselves out, which is true for big proportion of young people. But then there is this group of young people, I would estimate it based just on the next steps data, the proportion maybe is more like higher now, because obviously that has changed. But I would say 1/5 of that group who struggle indeed. So they are not in education, they are not in employment, they kind of stay in education, but they don't achieve qualifications that they can use, if at all. And they are, it depends how you define who is bilingual and what is your first language, because they are kind of bilingual because they do speak some English, and probably after being, you know, in education system, quite a lot of English. And they also, but that's another issue, whether they speak their home language. We get in the area where actually, you know, maybe there's some issues there as well. But it's like, how do we...
as well in the home language.
Yeah. Yes, I think, yeah, and that sort of links to parents, and it links to, and what is language as well, you know, how we define what is language and linguistic skills. But as this data showed so clearly, there is polarization. So it's not just that this group of young people on average are doing these things. So the average group of young people, some of them are doing so well, and some of them are not doing well at all. And if we use the same identifier, whichever way we push, the other group will struggle. So whether we push towards bilingual being great, or whether that everyone who, you know, who uses EAL struggles in some way, then, so I think it's, being careful about that message. And this is one of the main findings which makes this study so complicated. How do you then talk about it? Because as soon as you mention one, people will focus on one or the others, you know, whatever they prefer at that point. Government probably may prefer at this point that actually bilingual young people are doing really well, as we saw actually in some of their reports as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's also a positive message that we want to get out there, that bilingualism is good, that bilingualism has great benefits, and there are ways in which it could be that those benefits could be, you know, could accrue to more people and more positively. A few comments coming in here, which I'll just stress. Laura, please jump in if you want to address any of these. But Diana Sutton, from the Bell Foundation, director of the Bell Foundation, who's been in the meetings, with all the meetings with this piece of research, pointing out that you know that's why they're doing the research. You know, and that it's not just the research that Olga's carried out. Steve Strand at the University of Oxford also carried out a really important study for them and contributed to our process here as well. So we're very grateful for that. And I think Diana makes a really important point. The next step data, that was a different policy context, and there was EMAG support, which is the Ethnic Minority Achievement Grant, which if you go online, you'll find lots of information about, particularly through NALDIC, that was used in the system. So there was something different about that system to now. So the situation is likely to be slightly different. And just because immigration changes, groups that migrate change, there will be different elements in the system now that may mean the balance is slightly different. So we need to investigate it. Question from Tony Fazeli here. Do participants think Bell Foundation could or should focus on assessment levels for English proficiency across schools and FE and data on this in the NTPD and ILR? Ganesh, one thing, what would you all recommend? I mean, this question of the assessment levels, I know has been, it's been talked about for years and years, and it's caused lots of controversy. I know that the time when we were doing the strategy before, it was a very undecided issue. And I would imagine it's still pretty undecided. I'd love to be able to get Constant on to talk about that question, because I've heard him talk about the assessment in English so many times, and I think it would be really helpful, but we can't. So I'm not sure. I'm going to leave that one there for people to, there's plenty written also on the assessment and the problems of trying to assess language within schools. And we all know that you can't, you don't want to be assessing constantly, because people need to learn as well as to be assessed, and all of those arguments there. But certainly this idea that if we can't say this person is at a particular level of language, how can we allocate support, or how can we identify particular pathways that would suit that person if we just don't have that basic information? And I think certainly goes beyond just assessment of their English. I do think that the assessment of their home languages, particularly their literacy in their home languages, is really significant. And just as a country, to come back to our government, the skills that we have, the linguistic skills we have in this country are enormous, and they're underexploited. We don't use them. We don't send. So many people speak Polish in this country, but are they targeted to go and work in sectors where we've got big links with Poland, for example, and they could be working on developing new business for people, or government policies that are, etc., etc. There are so many examples that I've come across that people have identified where we could make much better use of these linguistic skills. If we did, we'd then value them more, and we might put more effort into ensuring that those people are better supported in their education. And David, again, comment here, I think really important that and I think this is probably why would this not be true? That those with lower achievements in English and maths are those who've struggled most during the pandemic, and we've seen that in every facet of our society, haven't we? Those who are most vulnerable were most vulnerable and have suffered the most. So it just suggests even further the urgency of doing more research with that group, making sure that policy recognises that group, and I think that's something that the Bell Foundation now can step in with some of this research done, and with the weight of its own organisation, and start to make sure that people do notice these things. Laura, anything to comment now?
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. And particularly, we've seen early signs that young people in particular are more at risk of losing jobs and things throughout the pandemic, and also through that change in the way education was taught and everything all in that period of time. So if you imagine that's across the board, saying that young people are more likely to be experiencing unemployment because of the pandemic, you imagine what the situation then is for people who already had other challenges in different ways, and we know, for example, that's come through from some of the work we're doing with refugee organisations, is that attitudes of employers as well may not always be positive, but again, there are signs that some attitudes are changing, and there's kind of a bit of hopefully some culture changes there. So yeah, definitely that is an issue.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you. Diana's given us some information here about the assessment. And this, from what Diana's saying here, would be a suggestion from the Bell Foundation in terms of this strategic approach, to just get people to to give some guidance and ask them to do it and put it in the ILR. I suppose it's also a question of what you do with that data when it comes back. And that goes back to the idea that this can't be a series of initiatives. It's got to be a strategic approach to this. So once we've got that data, what are we going to do with it? What does it inform, and who does it inform? Constance, again, coming on the assessment, good quality international research into EAL assessment, post-16 vocationally, we can learn a lot from this body of work. Well, that seems to me to be a good piece of work to be commissioned by somebody within the department or in one of the foundations, or just some of us here in universities who might be able to dedicate some research time to it. Though I presume, Constant, you could probably point to summaries of this research in various places, or where we could find that research. I don't know if there have been summaries or people bringing this together in anywhere at all. Oh, Olga, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, just last. I always say last point, but I think the idea about the home languages is quite interesting one, because obviously I know we have to focus on English as a skill, but I think the definition of bilingual young people and why they are so successful is the 2 languages or 3 languages. It's not just how well they know English. And I think some research has to go to explore more whether those, and this is just a hypothesis, whether those young people who are struggling and who are identified as, EL, or who use EL, also, or a high proportion of them, they do not speak actually their home language. It seems awkward. It's like they identified as EL because English is their additional language, but actually because parents gave up, or something happened speaking their home language to them. And there is this, it's actually psychological theory about language, development and things. So if your parents cannot support you with your first language, and parents are not really efficient, speakers in English, for example, that means that those children would not develop skills in either of the languages, struggling with English, but also not being truly bilingual in a sense of speaking more than one language. So they were kind of speaking English still with some challenges. And yeah, I think that's obviously not, that would require probably new data collection almost, because in the existing data, the focus is, if at all, on English, or as, what language you speak at home, or, how you see yourself. So, but what is the actual literacy levels in home languages, and how then that influences pathways and trajectories and outcomes in combination, obviously, with English language assessment.
Very good, very good. Interesting, really interesting. We're coming to the end of the time here. And so I'm going to, and unless we've got any burning questions that people want to type in as I'm just reading here, we've got a question from Anthony Tomei, who I can't answer this question, but it's certainly another one that would help in the picture. Who are there schools using this? The 5-level assessment scheme that Diana referred to. What's going on in schools? And obviously the Bell Foundation, Refugee Education UK, but also the Institute of Education is very well placed to find that out. And I'm not sure where we'd start to do that, but it's certainly something I think we should be thinking about it. And Diana's also saying that a lot of the schools are using the assessment framework that the Bell Foundation developed with Constant Young. So there probably is some, why are some schools using it? Is that just historical because they were connected to a project, or is it because some teachers came out of a particular teacher training program that was connected to it? I don't know. But what the factors are that mean that they've taken it up. Savannah Richardson also saying perhaps the local authorities have recommended them, and then to how we connected with the local authorities. And then I mean, I don't know schools very well at all, but then I'd imagine the academy system has made this more problematic in terms of spreading good practice, which I think is something that we all probably said at the time. It's quite an obvious development of taking out LAs, wasn't it? That you've got less. You've made your life more difficult in influencing policy in those schools if you split them all up and separate them into different bits. Okay, the fact, yeah, I would certainly support that point. The fact that so many places have taken these up is a credit to the work. We've got an awful lot of expertise in this country in this area. We have had for a long time. It's not something that, you know, we don't lack expertise in this area. In the school system, in our universities, in the third sector, there's lots of expertise, there's lots of experience, there's huge numbers of people who used to be in the sector working with EAL, working with young people with ESOL. A lot of those people needed to leave, needed to go and find other employment because of various political decisions that are made. So the expertise and the experience is certainly there. What we need to do, I think, is pull together more current evidence, put it in front of policymakers so that we can start to action some of those people and get them back into the sector and back into making a positive impact on these young people. I'm going to finish I'm going to close the seminar now, and what I'm going to do is just close with a comment here from Tony, who says that there's such good work in these areas, and she's thanking Olga and the team for the latest research. But I think the most important thing, it all builds and makes the case stronger. And part of our job as a community is to ensure that we're all aware of the various different pieces of work that we're doing, so that we can hone the language and so that we can make a message that's easy for policy to accept, that doesn't allow them to misinterpret that message, and doesn't allow certain groups of young people to fall through the gaps and to be missed in some of these initiatives. So thank you all very much for the contributions today. Thank you, Olga, for the presentation, and Vera for the presentation, and Laura for the discussion of these policy implications that obviously is such an important part of this. Thank you also to Li Wei, who I presume is directing the Institute at the moment, is not with us, but thank you for that. It's really wonderful to have to hear his voice and hear his thoughts on this as well. Thank you, extremely large thank you to the Bell Foundation for not just for this piece of research, but for taking an interest in this area in such a consistent way. And I think it's really important that an organisation of such weight in another area has made such a positive contribution to our ESOL and EAL communities, and is a real ally now in our the search for policy that will be effective and ways to support these young people in achieving what we all know they can and they should do. So thank you all very much. Hopefully you'll be able to get download the reports. Any comments, of course, just send them straight to Olga or send them straight to Laura, and anything, ways in which you can see that you could interact with this work going forward, be in contact. Okay, thank you all very much, and I'll